In the bustling command center of Xenon, the anticipation was palpable. Dr. Eliana Sereth, chief xenobiologist of Clarkson, monitored the arrival of the first human delegation from her workstation. Beside her, her assistant, Talon, a seasoned researcher in interstellar communications, adjusted the live feed from the docking bay. "Do you really think they'll have anything new to show us?" Talon asked, his voice tinged with the skepticism that many Clarksons felt towards humans. Eliana adjusted her glasses, her eyes never leaving the screen. "Let's not underestimate them. Their application for this summit was filled with intriguing concepts, especially in microbiology." The large doors of the docking bay slid open, revealing the human delegation. Leading them was Dr. John Mercer, a microbiologist known in the interstellar community for his pioneering work with nanotechnology. Beside him was his team, diverse in appearance and demeanor, clearly prepared for this historic encounter. "Dr. Sereth, I presume?" John extended his hand as he approached, a smile playing on his lips. "Yes, welcome to Clarkson, Dr. Mercer," Eliana replied, taking his hand. The handshake, a common human greeting, felt formal yet significant. "This is an honor for us. Your planet is renowned for its advances in xenobiological research," John said, his eyes scanning the high-tech surroundings. "We hope to learn as much from you," Eliana said, gesturing for them to walk towards her lab. "I'm particularly interested in your work with what you call microscopic swimmers." As they walked, Talon chimed in, "Yes, we've read your papers on these nanobots. How do you ensure they differentiate between harmful cells and healthy ones?" John's team member, Dr. Lisa Huang, answered, "That's the beauty of our design. Each nanobot is programmed to identify specific markers that are unique to pathogenic cells. It's quite effective." Eliana nodded, impressed despite herself. "Fascinating. We have similar applications here, but integrating such specificity at a nanoscopic level is still in developmental stages." Reaching the lab, Eliana introduced them to her own team. "This is Dr. Cale Morin, our lead in cellular regeneration, and Mira, our expert in synthetic biomes." John and his team exchanged greetings, and the room buzzed with the exchange of ideas and theories. Cale, curious and ever the skeptic, asked, "How do you power these nanobots? Our studies show significant challenges in powering devices at such a small scale." "We use a combination of biothermal and kinetic energy conversions," explained Lisa, pulling up diagrams on her tablet. "It allows for sustained operation without external power sources." The Clarksonians listened intently, their earlier reservations slowly giving way to genuine interest. Eliana, sensing the shift in mood, smiled. "Perhaps we could arrange a demonstration?" "Absolutely," John agreed. "We'd be happy to show you how they work in a controlled environment. It might just change how you view human technology." As they scheduled the demonstration, the atmosphere in the room was no longer merely courteous but charged with the excitement of potential breakthroughs. Eliana felt a stirring of respect for these humans, who had traveled so far not just to boast of their achievements but to share them. "Thank you for being so open with your technology," Eliana said as they concluded the plans. "This could be the beginning of a fruitful collaboration." John's smile was genuine. "We're looking forward to it, Dr. Sereth. I have a feeling our two species have a lot to learn from each other." As the humans departed the lab, Talon leaned over to Eliana. "Maybe they're not as primitive as we thought." Eliana watched them go, her mind abuzz with possibilities. "Maybe not, Talon. Maybe not." Chapter 2, The Human Enigma. The following day, Eliana and her assistant Talon made their way to the orbital platform where the humans had set up their temporary research facility. The sleek, modular structure was a stark contrast to the organic architecture of Clarkson cities. Its angular design spoke of efficiency, pragmatism, a reflection of the species that built it. "This is where we'll see if their microscopic swimmers are more than just flashy concepts," Talon said as they approached the airlock. He adjusted the pack slung over his shoulder, still visibly skeptical. "They've made it this far," Eliana replied, "and they're willing to show us their work in person. That's not something to dismiss outright." The airlock cycled open, revealing a member of the human team waiting to escort them. Dr. Lisa Huang greeted them with a polite nod. "Welcome aboard. Dr. Mercer is preparing the demonstration in Lab 2. If you'll follow me." The halls of the human station were narrow, lined with data terminals and panels blinking with soft, amber lights. The faint hum of machinery filled the air. Talon leaned toward Eliana. "Everything here feels so precise. No aesthetic frills. They must pour all their effort into function over form." "That doesn't make it less valuable," Eliana replied. "Different cultures focus on different priorities." As they entered Lab 2, John Mercer stood at a console, reviewing data on a holographic display. He glanced up with a smile as they entered. "Dr. Sareth, Talon, welcome. I hope you're ready to see these little guys in action." "Impress us," Talon said, crossing his arms. John chuckled and gestured to a small chamber filled with a nutrient solution. "What you're looking at is a controlled environment housing some of our nanobots. They're currently inactive, but once we introduce a target marker, what we call a decoy pathogen, you'll see how they respond." Eliana and Talon stepped closer. The display showed a magnified view of the chamber's contents. John tapped a few commands, and a small vial of synthetic pathogens was introduced into the fluid. The change was immediate. Tiny, shimmering dots began to move, swarming the invaders with surgical precision. "What you're seeing," John explained, "is the result of years of coding and testing. Each nanobot recognizes the unique protein structure of the pathogen. They latch on, neutralize it, and then signal for removal." Eliana leaned in, fascinated. "How do they handle mutations? If the pathogen alters its structure, will the bots still recognize it?" Lisa stepped forward. "That's where our adaptive algorithms come in. Once the bots encounter a new variant, they analyze its molecular changes and transmit the data back to our main system. From there, we update their programming. It's a continuous cycle of improvement." Talon narrowed his eyes at the display. "And what happens if these bots encounter Clarksonian biology? Would they see us as a threat?" "No," John said quickly. "Our programming is incredibly specific. We can tailor the bots to ignore certain biological markers, ensuring they only target the intended pathogens. That's why collaboration like this is so valuable. With your input, we could ensure the bots operate safely within Clarksonian physiology." Eliana exchanged a look with Talon. For the first time, he seemed less dismissive. "It's impressive," he admitted. "And you've tested these extensively on your own species?" John nodded. "We've been using them in controlled medical trials for years. The success rates have been exceptional. Our next step is broader application, helping other species tackle diseases we all face." Eliana crossed her arms, thoughtful. "This level of precision, it's not just about eliminating disease. It changes the entire approach to medicine. We'd need to rethink our protocols, retrain medical staff. Everything." "We'd help," John said. "This isn't just about showing off what we can do. It's about sharing knowledge, improving lives on both our worlds." Talon glanced at John. "And what's in it for you? What do humans gain by helping us?" John met his gaze evenly. "Better allies, a healthier galaxy, the opportunity to learn from your expertise in fields we've only just begun to explore. Collaboration benefits both sides." The room fell silent for a moment. Eliana studied the display, watching the tiny machines continue their meticulous work. For all her doubts, she couldn't deny the potential she saw in this technology. "All right," she said finally. "You've piqued my interest. I'd like to see more data on how these bots interact with non-human biology. If you're open to it, we could provide samples for controlled testing." John's expression brightened. "We'd welcome that. The more we learn, the better we can make these tools." "Thank you, Dr. Sareth." Talon exhaled, still hesitant but clearly impressed. "I'll admit, this is better than I expected. Just don't expect me to be completely sold yet." "I'll take that as a challenge," John said with a grin. "We'll earn your trust." As they left the lab, Talon turned to Eliana. "They're not what I expected. Still, we'll need to be cautious." "Caution is always wise," Eliana agreed. But if this works, Talon, it could be the start of something remarkable. Chapter 3 in the lab. Inside the heart of the human vessel, the atmosphere was surprisingly lively. The room hummed with activity as researchers flitted between stations, discussing data and examining displays. At the center of it all stood John Mercer, gesturing animatedly to his team as they prepared for a hands-on demonstration of the nanobot's capabilities. Eliana and Talon stepped through the lab's threshold, greeted by a subtle shift in the air, cool, controlled, and crisp with sterilized scents. Mercer turned to them, smiling. "Welcome back. I hope you're ready for something a little more interactive today." Talon raised an eyebrow, folding his arms. Interactive how? Watching them on a screen is one thing, but handling them is something else entirely. John beckoned them closer to a large, cylindrical containment vessel. Inside, a faintly glowing liquid swirled gently, the subtle movements of the nanobots just barely visible to the naked eye. "We've prepped a sample environment where you can directly control the deployment of the nanobots. Consider it a practical test." "Control them directly?" Eliana asked, her curiosity piqued. "Exactly," John said. "We've developed a user interface that's intuitive enough for someone new to the technology. This way, you can see how they respond to different stimuli in real time." Talon stepped closer, skepticism still lingering in his tone. "You're going to let us, non-humans, manipulate them just like that? What if we mess something up?" John chuckled. "The system is designed to be foolproof. You'll be working in a closed environment. No risk to anyone. Just an opportunity to explore what these bots can really do." Dr. Lisa Huang joined them, holding a thin, tablet-like device. "Here's the control interface. It's straightforward. You select a target, set parameters, and then deploy. The bots handle the rest." Talon glanced at Eliana, then back at the interface. "Fine. Show me how this works." Lisa handed him the device and began walking him through the process. Eliana leaned in to observe as Talon tapped on the screen, highlighting a simulated pathogen. The display shifted, showing the bots moving towards the target, neutralizing it methodically. "Not bad," Talon muttered, adjusting the parameters to test a different scenario. "They're quick. They're efficient," John said, stepping next to Eliana. "The real beauty of this system is its adaptability. Once you understand the basics, you can modify the bot's behavior to handle a range of biological threats." Eliana studied the screen, impressed by the simplicity of the interface. "You've managed to make this technology accessible." "That's not an easy feat. It's been a long road," John admitted. "The key was focusing on usability as much as function. We wanted these tools to be something anyone could pick up and utilize effectively." Talon's face shifted from skepticism to cautious approval. "I'll admit it's impressive. But what's stopping someone from turning this into a weapon?" Lisa jumped in before John could respond. "That's where strict controls and ethical guidelines come in. The bots are coded for specific tasks and designed to deactivate if they're misused. Of course, like any technology, it requires responsible oversight." "That's a lot of trust to put in the hands of users," Talon said, but his tone was less combative now. "Still, I can see the potential." John offered a small smile. "We're not naive about the risks. That's why we believe in transparency and collaboration. The more people from different backgrounds contribute to this field, the safer and more effective it will be." Eliana turned back to the glowing chamber, watching the bots do their work. "It's remarkable. I can see how this could transform the way we approach medicine." "And not just medicine," John said. "Environmental cleanup, agriculture, even industrial processes. These bots can adapt to countless applications." Talon handed the tablet back to Lisa, his expression thoughtful. "You've got something here. I'll give you that." "Glad to hear it," John said, his grin widening. "This is just the beginning. With your input, we can refine the technology even further." Eliana nodded. "We'll provide more detailed biological samples. I'd like to see how the bots handle our cellular structures." "That's what we were hoping for," John said. "The more data we have, the better we can ensure compatibility and safety." As the demonstration wound down, Talon stepped back and crossed his arms again. All right, I'll admit you've got my attention now. But don't think I'm going to roll over and start singing your praises just yet. John laughed. Fair enough. I'll take it one step at a time. Eliana smiled at the exchange. Talon just needs a little more convincing. Keep showing him results and he'll come around. As they left the lab, the weight of skepticism felt lighter. While Talon wasn't ready to fully embrace the humans' technology, the progress they'd seen that day had begun to shift his perspective. Eliana, too, felt a growing confidence that working together could lead to breakthroughs neither species could achieve alone. Chapter 4. Cultural Exchange. The next morning, Eliana waited outside the main hall where the human delegation was stationed. Talon leaned against the stone wall beside her, arms crossed as always, casting wary glances at the humans walking to and from the building. He had volunteered to come along, though Eliana wasn't sure if it was out of curiosity or a lingering suspicion he wanted to satisfy. They're late, Talon remarked, his tone clipped. They're punctual. We're early, Eliana corrected. She tapped a button on her wristband, checking the time. Besides, this is an informal outing, not an intergalactic summit. Talon gave a skeptical grunt. Doesn't mean we should be waiting around. I hope you have a plan. I do. The cultural archives first, followed by the market district. I think they'll find our artisan quarter especially interesting. At that moment, John Mercer stepped out of the hall, his ever-present smile and relaxed demeanor making him stand out among his more serious colleagues. Behind him was Lisa Huang and another human researcher, Mark Danziger, who had joined them during the last demonstration. Mark was taller than John, with a more reserved presence, but his curiosity was just as evident. Dr. Sareth, Talon, John greeted warmly. Apologies if we kept you waiting. It took a moment to get everyone together. You're just on time, Eliana said, offering a small smile. I'm glad Mark could join us. Mark gave a polite nod. I've been looking forward to seeing Clarksonian culture up close. And I'm curious to see what your artisans can create, Lisa added. Then we'll start at the archives, Eliana said, gesturing for them to follow her. It's a short walk from here. As they moved through Xenon streets, Talon stayed a step behind Eliana, keeping a watchful eye on their guests. John, meanwhile, walked alongside Eliana, glancing around at the intricate carvings on the walls and the gleaming crystalline structures overhead. This city feels alive, John said after a moment. Not just functional. Every corner seems designed to tell a story. It is, Eliana replied. We don't separate function and form as humans seem to. Every building, every street has a history. We find that beauty and purpose can coexist. Mark looked up at a large mural etched into the wall of a building. And this? What's the story here? Eliana slowed her pace. That depicts the era before space travel, when our ancestors began exploring the seas of our planet. Those boats led to the first explorations of other continents and, eventually, the stars. Talon spoke up, his voice tinged with a faint pride. Every Clarksonian child learns that history. It's as much a part of us as our biology. Sounds like a rich tradition, Lisa remarked. We have our explorers and pioneers back on Earth too. Maybe not as artistically celebrated, though. John chuckled. Give us time. Maybe once we stop fighting among ourselves, we'll catch up. They reached the cultural archives, an expansive hall with towering shelves of crystalline data blocks. Archivists moved gracefully along elevated platforms, retrieving or storing data with elegant tools. Eliana led the group to an interactive station. Here, she said, tapping a control. A holographic projection appeared, showing a timeline of Clarkson's artistic and scientific milestones. You can browse through our artistic achievements, from early sculptures to the more recent developments in crystalline architecture. Lisa stepped forward, her expression one of awe. These are incredible. The level of detail. How do you even carve something that intricate? We don't carve, Eliana explained. We grow the crystals in a controlled environment. The patterns form naturally, guided by precise energy fields. It's a technique passed down through generations. Talon smirked slightly. Still think we're primitive? John glanced at him, his grin unshaken. I don't think I ever used that word. Talon didn't respond, but the corner of his mouth twitched as if he wanted to smile. As the humans explored the archives, Eliana noticed that John and Mark often huddled together, pointing out details and exchanging low, animated remarks. They seemed genuinely captivated, not just by the artifacts, but by the process behind them. It reminded her that curiosity wasn't unique to any one species. After the archives, they walked toward the market district. The air grew warmer as they passed through the bustling artisan quarter. Stalls lined the streets, displaying handcrafted goods, woven textiles, crystalline sculptures, bioluminescent art pieces. The humans paused frequently, asking questions, touching the edges of a fabric or peering closely at a glowing ornament. John stopped at a stall where a vendor was shaping a small, glowing crystal into a delicate spiral. Is this similar to what we saw in the archives? The vendor, a wizened Clarksonian with steady hands, nodded. Yes, though on a smaller scale. These are made for personal adornment, not for large-scale construction. Mark leaned in, examining the tool the vendor used. What powers that? I don't see any visible energy source. It's a thermal resonance device, Eliana said. It draws energy from ambient heat and channels it into a precise field. That allows for delicate manipulations. Brilliant, John said, then turned to Eliana. This kind of craftsmanship, does it ever make its way into your scientific tools? Instruments or medical equipment? Maybe. Occasionally, she replied, though we tend to keep our medical tool. I'd love to see what a hybrid approach might look like, John said. Imagine combining Clarkson artistry with human practical engineering. The results could be astounding. Talon, standing nearby, raised an eyebrow. Careful, Mercer. You're starting to sound impressed. John laughed. What can I say? You've got a good thing going here. By the time the group returned to the main hall, the sun was beginning to set. Eliana turned to her guests. Thank you for taking the time to explore our city. I hope you found it worthwhile. Worthwhile doesn't begin to cover it, John said. This has given us a lot to think about. Lisa nodded. I think we've only scratched the surface of what we can learn from each other. Even Mark, usually quiet, offered a rare smile. There's a depth to your culture that's humbling. I'm glad I came along. Eliana glanced at Talon, who gave a subtle shrug. It was decent, he said, his voice low, but there was no mistaking the faint approval in his tone. As the humans departed, Eliana and Talon stood watching them go. So, she said, breaking the silence. What do you think? They're still rough around the edges, Talon replied. But they're not just here to show off. They want to learn to connect. That's something, at least. Eliana nodded slowly. It is. Chapter 5, The Festival of Lights. The Festival of Lights was one of Clarkson's most celebrated traditions. Every year, the streets of Xenon were transformed into a dazzling display of luminescent art and music. Trees that lined the main avenues glowed with vibrant, shifting colors, their crystalline branches refracting light into cascading rainbows. Bioluminescent sculptures floated above the crowds, casting gentle glimmers that danced along the streets below. Eliana stood at the edge of the festival square, watching as Talon adjusted the display on a handheld console. He was assisting one of the event coordinators in synchronizing the lights with the evening's music program. Just a little more to the left, Eliana said, leaning in. Talon shifted the control slightly. How's that? Perfect, she replied. The center column's balance was off, but now it looks seamless. I still don't understand why you volunteered us to help with this, Talon said, glancing up from the device. Isn't this more of an art director's job? I thought it would be a good opportunity to introduce our human guests to the festival's tradition, Eliana said, her voice light. Besides, you could use a break from analyzing data. Talon smirked but didn't argue. Well, you're not wrong, and it is nice to see the city in full color again. It's been a while. As the sky darkened, the festival began in earnest. Music, rich and harmonious, resonated through the square. Crowds of Clarksonians filled the streets, their luminescent clothing adding to the shimmering spectacle. John and Mark arrived not long after, their expressions lighting up at the sight of the glowing city. "This is incredible," John said as he approached Eliana and Talon. "I've never seen anything like it." Mark, who was usually reserved, seemed genuinely captivated. "The scale of it's not just the lights or the colors. It feels alive." "That's the idea," Eliana said, smiling at their awe. "The festival is meant to remind us of the living connections we share, with each other and with the planet." John nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the glowing sculptures that floated in the air. "It's beautiful, and it's something we humans could learn from. We're often so focused on what we can build that we forget to appreciate the way it all connects." Talon, standing just behind Eliana, folded his arms. "Not a bad sentiment. I didn't expect you to be this reflective, Mercer." John grinned. "Hey, I'm full of surprises." As they walked through the festival, Eliana pointed out the various displays. She explained how each sculpture was grown from native crystals, and how each tree's light was powered by a carefully maintained symbiotic relationship with native organisms. Mark asked a stream of questions, his scientific curiosity clearly piqued. "How long does it take to grow one of these trees to this size?" Mark asked, examining a towering crystalline oak that shimmered in waves of purple and blue. "Decades," Eliana replied. "We cultivate them carefully, ensuring they thrive in their natural habitat. It's a long process, but worth it." "And the sculptures?" John asked, gesturing to a floating sphere of light that shifted colors as if responding to the music. "Those are formed from the same materials as our architectural crystals, but the process is more intricate," Talon said. "Artisans guide their growth in special chambers. Each one is unique." John leaned in closer, studying the sculpture. "It's not just art. There's a lot of science behind it." "Art and science aren't separate for us," Eliana said. "We see them as two parts of a whole." The group continued through the festival, stopping at various performances and installations. At one point, they arrived at a pavilion where dancers moved gracefully under cascading lights. The music swelled, and the crowd fell silent, entranced by the ethereal performance. As the dance concluded, John turned to Eliana. "I can't thank you enough for bringing us here. I didn't realize how much I needed to see something like this." Eliana tilted her head, curious. "You needed to see it?" He nodded. "After spending so much time in labs, looking at data, it's easy to forget what we're working for. It's not just survival or innovation. It's moments like this, the kind of beauty that reminds you why life is worth improving." Eliana smiled, touched by his sincerity. "That's exactly why we hold this festival, to remind ourselves of what we're striving to preserve." Talon, who had been quiet for a while, added, "It's good to see you humans can appreciate it too. I wasn't sure if you'd understand." John chuckled. "Don't underestimate us, Talon. We're not as dense as you think." "You've proven that tonight," Talon admitted, a small smile forming on his face. The night wore on, and the festival reached its crescendo. The central display, a massive crystalline structure at the heart of the square, lit up in a dazzling array of colors, accompanied by a soaring orchestral piece. The crowd cheered, their voices merging with the music. John stood next to Eliana, his eyes on the glowing centerpiece. "I don't think I'll ever forget this." "Good," Eliana said. "Neither will we." Chapter 6. Interspecies Relations. The week after the Festival of Lights, Eliana's lab was abuzz with activity. Talon had suggested combining human nanotechnology with Clarksonian bioarchitectural methods in a small, controlled project, and the idea had caught fire. John and Mark joined them to help implement the experiment, and the four of them found themselves working side by side every day. The lab echoed with overlapping voices and occasional bursts of laughter, a blend of two worlds in full collaboration. "Talon, pass me that crystalline sample," Eliana called across the table. Talon reached over, grabbing the transparent shard and handing it to her. "You're going to run that same assay again? It already gave the results we expected." "I want to verify it," Eliana replied, turning the crystal under a beam of light. "If the nanobots can integrate as smoothly as we think, this could open up whole new applications for both our species." "She's right," John chimed in, seated at a nearby terminal. "We're talking about creating a stable hybrid material. That's not just one more test. It's a foundation." Mark, who was meticulously calibrating a small piece of equipment, glanced over. "The key is to keep the biological properties of the crystal intact. If we lose that, the material is no better than a human alloy. And that's what makes it interesting," Talon admitted, leaning back against the counter. "We're not just adapting to each other's strengths. We're creating something entirely new." John nodded. "Exactly. If we can do this, imagine what it could mean: improved medical implants, more efficient environmental systems, even better energy storage." "Then we better make sure it works," Eliana said, adjusting a control on the apparatus. "Let's run this test and see if the data backs up our theory." As the test commenced, the group fell into an easy rhythm, each focusing on their task. Talon and Mark monitored the machinery, Lisa assisted with data collection, and Eliana and John reviewed the initial readings on a holographic display. The air in the room was charged, not with tension, but with excitement. Every step forward felt like a shared victory. "So, John," Talon said after a while, his voice conversational, "why did you become a microbiologist? Seems like a pretty specific field to devote yourself to." John looked up from the display, a faint smile on his lips. "I've always been fascinated by the unseen. When I was a kid, I'd spend hours with my dad's old microscope, looking at pond water, soil samples, whatever I could find. It just clicked. The idea that the smallest things can have the biggest impact." Eliana glanced at him, intrigued. "And that curiosity never faded?" "Not once," John said. "Every time I make a discovery, it feels like opening a door to a whole new world. Working with your people now, it's like finding an entirely different set of doors." Talon nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I can understand that. For me, it was our natural biomes. The way Clarkson's ecosystems are so interconnected. I've spent years studying how every part fits together, how a single change can ripple out." Mark leaned in, adding, "It's not so different from what we're doing now. We're creating something that has to fit seamlessly into both of our worlds." Eliana smiled. "And that's why this project is important. It's not just a technical challenge. It's a new way of thinking about each other, about collaboration." They worked late into the night, losing track of time as they refined their approach. By the time the test concluded, the results displayed on the holographic screen were promising. The material they'd created showed the strength and adaptability of the human nanobots combined with the stability and biocompatibility of Clarksonian crystals. "It's working," Eliana said, her voice filled with quiet triumph. "It's actually working." Talon let out a low whistle. "I didn't think we'd get this far so quickly." Mark, still examining the readout, nodded. "We'll need to run more tests, of course, but this is a solid start." John grinned, his tired eyes shining with excitement. "And it's just the beginning. If we can do this, we can take it so much further." Eliana turned to the group, her gaze sweeping across them. "This wasn't something any one of us could have done alone. It took all of us, our combined knowledge, our willingness to share and adapt. I think that's worth remembering." Talon looked at her and nodded. "I have to admit, Eliana, when you first brought them in, I thought it would just be a formality. But seeing what we've done here, I'm starting to think there's more potential in this partnership than I gave it credit for." John glanced at Talon, his smile widening. "You keep saying things like that, Talon, and I might start thinking you like having us around." "Don't push your luck, Mercer," Talon replied, but the smirk on his face softened the words. As they shut down the equipment for the night, the lab grew quiet. The only sounds were the faint hum of the machinery and the occasional murmur of voices. It was the kind of silence that came after a day of meaningful progress. A silence that carried with it the weight of what they had just accomplished and the possibilities that lay ahead. Chapter 7, Diplomatic Tensions. After the success in the lab, Eliana and her team were invited to present their findings at an upcoming interspecies conference. Held on neutral ground at the Stellan Archive, the gathering was intended to showcase cooperative advances between Clarksonians and humans. But as the date approached, diplomatic tensions started to surface. "We're getting pushback from the council," Talon said, walking beside Eliana through the crystalline halls of the research center. "Some of the senior members aren't comfortable with the level of access we've given the humans." Eliana kept her gaze straight ahead. "We've followed every protocol. They approved the initial exchange. Why the sudden concern?" "Because it's working," Talon replied bluntly. "And not everyone wants it to." When they entered the lab, John and Mark were already there, reviewing presentation slides. The two men looked up as the Clarksonians arrived, their expressions shifting from focus to apprehension. "Is everything okay?" John asked. Eliana nodded, though her face was serious. "Just some internal politics. Nothing we can't handle." Mark exchanged a glance with John. "If this is going to cause problems, we can pull back. We don't want to make things harder for you." "Pulling back would make it worse," Eliana said. "The council is cautious, but they're not unreasonable. If we can show them the benefits, if we can present our findings clearly, they'll see the value of continuing our collaboration." John sighed. "It's just frustrating. We've made real progress. I didn't think we'd hit a wall like this after everything we've accomplished." Talon crossed his arms, leaning against a nearby console. "It's not a wall. It's more of a hurdle. You humans are used to fighting your way through opposition. Here it's about persuasion, reason, convincing people that the long-term gain is worth the risk." John looked at him, raising an eyebrow. "Are you saying you trust us now?" "I'm saying I trust the results we've achieved together," Talon replied. "That's a start." Eliana stepped between them, placing a hand on the console. "What we need to focus on is the presentation. We have solid data, and we have a clear message. When we work together, we can achieve breakthroughs that neither species could reach alone. Let's make sure that message is impossible to ignore." The group spent the next several hours refining their presentation. Mark ran simulations to illustrate the material's properties under stress. Talon updated charts to show how the hybrid structure maintained both strength and flexibility. Lisa compiled comparative data from human trials, highlighting the reduction in complications thanks to Clarksonian biological integration. As they worked, the mood in the room shifted from concern to determination. Even Talon, who usually kept a wary distance from the humans, found himself nodding in agreement with Mark's suggestions. "You've got a good eye for detail," Talon said at one point, surprising everyone. Mark shrugged. "It's not just my eye. It's the data. It speaks for itself." By the time they finished, the presentation was polished and ready. Eliana looked at each of them in turn. "This is solid. We have everything we need to make our case." "And if they still don't listen?" John asked. "Then we keep pushing," Eliana said. "Change takes time, but it starts with making our voices heard." Talon smirked. "You're sounding more human by the day, Eliana." She shot him a look. "And you're starting to sound a little more optimistic." "Careful, Talon. People might think you're warming up to them." The next morning, they traveled to the Stellan Archive. The massive structure, built on a neutral space station, was a hub of intergalactic diplomacy. Its vaulted halls and intricate carvings reflected the cultures of dozens of civilizations. As the group walked toward the main conference chamber, they passed delegations from other species. Some nodded in recognition, while others merely glanced at them and continued on. The tension was palpable, but Eliana refused to let it affect her focus. Inside the chamber, rows of representatives from various planets filled the seats. A high central podium stood at the front, flanked by holographic displays. Eliana and her team took their place on stage. When the murmurs in the room quieted, Eliana stepped forward. "Distinguished delegates," she began, "we are here to present the results of an unprecedented collaboration between Clarksonians and humans. What you will see is not just a technological advance, but an example of what can be achieved when two species work in harmony. She gestured to John, who took over seamlessly. Through the integration of Clarksonian biocrystals and human nanotechnology, we've created a hybrid material that outperforms anything our species have developed individually. The data you'll see today proves the viability of this approach. Mark displayed the simulations, Lisa provided statistical comparisons, and Talon, surprising everyone, spoke briefly about the cultural considerations that had guided their work. The room was silent as the presentation concluded. For a moment, Eliana worried that the lack of questions was a bad sign. But then one delegate, an older Clarksonian council member, stood up. "This project represents a significant departure from tradition," he said, his voice measured. "What assurances can you offer that this partnership will not compromise our sovereignty or our values?" John stepped forward. "With respect, council member, this is not about compromise. It's about evolution. We're not asking you to abandon your traditions, only to consider how they can grow. Working together doesn't mean losing our identities. It means finding a way to enhance them." The council member regarded him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Thank you. I will take this under advisement." More questions followed, but the tone had shifted. By the end of the session, there was a sense that the project was no longer just an experiment. It was a possibility. A chance to redefine what cooperation could look like. As they left the chamber, John turned to Eliana. "That could have gone worse." Eliana smiled faintly. "It could have gone much worse. But we're not done yet. We still have work to do." Talon walked beside them, glancing at John. "You held your own in there, Mercer. Maybe you Clarksonians have some competition when it comes to diplomacy." "Don't push your luck," Talon said, though his grin suggested he wasn't entirely serious. As they made their way back to the ship, the team felt a new sense of possibility. They had taken the first step in showing the galaxy that when species work together, they can achieve something greater than they ever could alone. Chapter 8: Unity Achieved. The weeks following the conference were marked by cautious optimism. The presentation had sparked interest among influential Clarksonian council members and human delegates alike. Though not everyone was immediately convinced, the project was granted a probationary period during which further trials and collaborative research would take place. Back in the lab, Eliana, Talon, John, and Mark worked tirelessly to refine the hybrid material. The room was once again filled with the sound of overlapping conversations, clicking instruments, and the low hum of machines. The team had settled into a comfortable rhythm, dividing tasks, bouncing ideas off each other, and even sharing the occasional joke. "So, Talon," John began as he scanned a readout, "I've been meaning to ask, what made you decide to work in bioarchitecture?" Talon glanced up from his console, slightly taken aback. "I thought it was obvious. Clarkson's entire environment relies on a balance of biological and architectural systems. It's our way of life." John nodded. "Sure, but everyone chooses their path for a reason. There must have been a moment when you decided this was it." Talon hesitated, then shrugged. "I guess it was when I saw how delicate that balance really is. As a student, I joined a restoration project in the eastern wetlands. Seeing how small adjustments could either destroy or revitalize the ecosystem, that was the turning point. That's what drew me to microbiology," John said. "The idea that the tiniest changes can make the biggest difference. I guess we have more in common than I thought." Talon raised an eyebrow. "Don't let it go to your head." Mark, seated nearby, chuckled. "We'll add it to the list of unexpected similarities. Right below stubbornness." "Sounds about right," Talon said, cracking a rare grin. Eliana, who had been focused on analyzing a set of data points, looked up. "If we're done trading life stories, can we get back to the task at hand?" "Of course," John said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "Just trying to keep things light." "Appreciated," Eliana replied. "But we're close to a breakthrough, and I don't want to lose momentum." The team returned to their work, but the atmosphere remained amicable. Over the past few weeks, the initial tension between them had eased. What had once been a cautious partnership had grown into a genuine collaboration. They weren't just colleagues from different species anymore. They were a team. As the days passed, they refined the hybrid material to the point where it outperformed even their most optimistic projections. It was stronger than the original Clarksonian crystals, more adaptable than human alloys, and still maintained the natural biological properties that made it so unique. "We've got something here," Eliana said one evening, her voice filled with quiet confidence. "We sure do," John agreed. "This could be the foundation for something much bigger." Talon leaned back in his chair, looking at the material on the display. "I never thought I'd say this, but it's good to see it all come together. I wasn't sure this kind of collaboration would work." Mark nodded. "I think we've proven it can. Now it's just a matter of showing the rest of the galaxy." Their chance to do so came sooner than expected. An emergency summit was called after a mysterious illness began spreading among a neighboring species. The Clarksonian human team's work was presented as a potential solution. If the hybrid material could be adapted to create medical implants that delivered targeted treatments, it might save thousands of lives. The summit was tense. Delegates from multiple worlds debated the safety and feasibility of using the hybrid material. Skepticism was high, and the opposition voiced concerns about untested technology and the risks of interspecies interference. John, standing beside Eliana and Talon, addressed the assembly. "I understand your concerns, but the data speaks for itself. This material has undergone rigorous testing in controlled environments. We're not asking you to accept it blindly. We're asking you to consider the possibilities." Eliana stepped forward. "For years, we've each approached our challenges independently. This project shows what we can achieve when we share knowledge, resources, and expertise. It's not about one species dominating the other. It's about learning from each other." Talon, who had been silent until now, added, "This material isn't just a scientific achievement. It's a reminder that even in the face of doubt and disagreement, cooperation is possible. We've done the work. The results are here. Now it's up to all of you to decide if we'll move forward together." The room was silent for a moment before a delegate from the affected species spoke up. "We don't have the luxury of waiting. If this material can save lives, we must act now. I vote to move forward." One by one, the delegates voted. The majority agreed to allow the hybrid material to be used in the treatment effort, marking a turning point in interspecies collaboration. The decision was met with cautious optimism, and the project officially moved from trial to implementation. As the team left the summit, Talon turned to John. "You know, Mercer, you're not as bad at diplomacy as I thought." John laughed. "High praise coming from you, Talon." Eliana smiled. "It's just the beginning. There's still a lot of work to be done, but this is a step in the right direction." Mark looked back at the summit hall, then at the group. "It feels like we're finally getting somewhere." They returned to their lab with a renewed sense of purpose. Over the following weeks, the team worked tirelessly to adapt the hybrid material for medical use, knowing that their efforts would directly impact countless lives. Through the challenges and triumphs, the group remained close, their bond strengthened by everything they had overcome together. As their creation was deployed, it became clear that their collaboration wasn't just a one-time success. It was the foundation for a new era of interspecies innovation and understanding, one that neither humans nor Clarksonians could have achieved alone.